The game with cycles is getting lower rendering times while maintaining the quality of the renders, so we're gonna review the relevant settings that you need to know to get the best results and which you can skip. I'm Dude Blender and let's jump right in. We're in the Render Properties tab. First up is the feature set. The difference between supported and experimental is that if you select experimental, I'm gonna add a subdivision modifier to this one, and if I go to the modifiers, you'll see that you get an adaptive subdivision option. If you click it, nothing will seem to happen, but the idea with this is that the farther away the object is from the camera, Blender will calculate different levels of subdivisions, with the idea of using the calculating resources more efficiently. You probably don't need to use this in most cases, but if you're doing animations in large scenes where distances might vary greatly, then you might want to turn that on and make sure that it's on in the subdivision modifier of your models. The rendering device is by far the single biggest time saver for your renders. Of course, you need to have a graphics card, so if you do, use it. That's why we paid extra for it. CPU will use the CPU to calculate the render, while GPU compute will use the settings in Edit, Preferences, System, and in this Cycles Render Devices panel. Depending on your machine, you'll get different options here. If you have an NVIDIA graphics card, you'll get CUDA and optics. If you have an AMD card or processor, you'll get HIP, and if you have Intel, you'll get one API. If you're using a Mac with Apple Silicon, you'll get here the metal option. Optics is the best option as it makes use of hardware ray tracing. You should see the option if you have an NVIDIA graphics card of the RTX 30 series or above. Tick the checkbox of your card and you're good to go. If you don't have the option of optics, the next best is CUDA, but that might mean that your graphics card is a little old, but it still will be better than using the CPU. I'm gonna render this first with the CPU. It took 45 seconds. Now I'm gonna render with the GPU. It took 16.33 seconds. So there's no question here. If you have a graphics card, use it as much as possible. Open shading language is available with optics, and this is cool if you know how to write shaders. I don't, so I've never used this. Sampling is the other big time saver. More samples will result in less noise, but it will also take longer. Now, many of us use here powers of 2, so 16, 32, 64, 128, and so on and so forth. It's kind of a thing, but I really don't know if there's any benefit of doing so. 16 samples is the very least that I will ever use, and combined with the denoiser, it's usually enough for test renders. For final renders, you might want to go as high as 8,000 samples, although this will really increase the rendering time. So this is the render with 8,192 samples, and it took 2 minutes and 34 seconds. If we compare that to 16 samples, that one took 16 seconds. So the increase in time is quite significant, and you'll probably notice that in scenes like this one that has simple shapes, simple materials, simple lighting, the difference in quality is pretty much unnoticeable. This 8,000, 16. 8,000, 16. So you might not notice anything at all. If you're not getting any increase in quality for your time, then you should go as low as possible. You should increase the samples only when you actually notice that there's a difference. We also have some adaptive sampling options, so the noise threshold will continue to sample the pixel up until it reaches the max samples if the noise is above this threshold. I usually leave this in 0.01, but you can go as low as 0.001, which will significantly increase your rendering times. You can also set a time limit for your renders, which might be useful if you're rendering over and over again the same thing to test different lightings or materials, but you don't want it to take too long, so you might set this to 5 or 10 seconds. I never use this because then I don't have any control at all on the quality of the image, so I'll usually just leave this at 0.01 and change the max samples depending on the quality that I want. If you set the threshold to 0, it will just let Blender decide for you. Next thing is the denoiser. This is as close as you can get to witchcraft. If I go to the compositing workflow and I move all of these to the side, the render layers node gives you the noisy image socket if you have the denoiser enabled here. If I connect this, you'll see the noisy image. So this is the image that we rendered with 16 samples, and you'll see that it's almost unusable, especially here in the transparencies. This image looks like complete garbage. We would never be able to use it, but once we apply the denoiser, it completely changes the image. That's why we can go as low as 16 samples. In fact, I could probably do this with 8 or 4 samples, and when using the denoiser, you get an image of a good quality. Of course, as your scene gets more complicated and heavy with textures and shapes and lights, then more samples will noticeably increase the quality of your image. But for scenes like this, low samples and the denoiser are more than enough. You get a few options here for the denoiser. Open image is the best option, so use that. If you don't have that option, just go with optics. Passes, we want to use albedo on normal, and prefilter accurate. Every time we can use the GPU, we want to do that, so click on this checkbox. One more thing to know about the denoiser is that you can either use it here with this checkbox, or you can use the compositor with the denoise node. If you want to use the node, you'll have to go to the view layer properties and enable the denoising data pass. This will give you additional sockets in the render layers node. If I turn it off, you'll see that they go away. To use this, you want to connect the denoising normal to normal, denoising albedo to albedo, and you want to connect the noisy image here. So if you have the denoiser enabled here, you want to use the noisy image socket. If you don't have it enabled, then the image will be the noisy image, so we can just connect that here. Now I'm going to render this again to see if there's any difference. So this is the image that I rendered with the compositor denoise node, and you'll see that it takes slightly more render time as compared to the previous one, 1633 versus 1685, but it does use less memory. So this is with the denoise node, 653 megs. If I don't use the denoise node, I get almost twice as much memory usage. The quality, of course, is exactly the same. So usually, if you're not doing any other compositing, you're okay just clicking on this button. Light tree takes into account the distance and intensity of light to calculate samples more effectively. And if you turn it off, you can change the light threshold value, which calculates the contribution of individual lights and disregards those whose contribution to the scene is below the threshold. This doesn't give you a significant advantage in rendering time, so I just leave it as it is. In the advanced settings, we have the seed option that changes the pattern of the noise, and we have the use animated seed button here. The idea with this is that if you're rendering an animation, it will change the seed in every frame, and the idea with that is to make the noise less noticeable. Of course, this is only useful when rendering animations. Here's an animation without the animated seed, and with the animated seed, and side by side. I don't know if this is gonna be noticeable in YouTube. I can confirm that it does look different, but I could not say that it definitely looks better. It just looks different. I only used 16 samples for these animations, so maybe more samples would have better results, but at least in this test, I don't think it makes a huge difference. Sample offset is used when using multiple computers to render, which I've never used, and in fact, to keep the video short and useful, I'm just gonna skip to the options that actually have a significant positive effect on your renders. Light paths, max bounces, allows you to change the number of times light can bounce off of surfaces to create more realistic lighting. So in this scene we have, I think, 7 lights. I'm gonna render it with the default settings. So this took 16, almost 17 seconds. One more thing to note here, you see that I am not using the denoiser, and that's because for some scenes, like this one, I actually do like how the noise looks. So keep in mind that if you use enough samples, you'll get rid of the fireflies, and the noise might actually look pretty cool. Now let's go to slot 2. I'm gonna decrease this to 2 and transparent to 2 as well, and I'm gonna render that again. This is the render. It took 16.45 seconds as opposed to 1693, so it's a tiny reduction, but you'll see that the quality of the image is significantly reduced, especially in the splash and in the droplets. However, the rest of the scene is pretty much the same, so depending on your scene, you might want to reduce these numbers if they don't affect the quality of your image and save a little bit of time. I'm gonna skip all the way to simplify, and here you can limit the max subdivision in the subdivision modifiers of all of the objects that you have in your scene to reduce the render time. You can also reduce the child particles in all of your particle systems, and you can also limit the textures that are being used in your scene. This one is actually quite useful because usually the models that you download from the internet have high resolution textures, and if you're rendering a post for Instagram, you probably don't need that because the size of the image is going to be like 1080 times 1080. So if you have a high quality texture, then you might just be wasting time. So depending on the size of your render, this might actually save you a little bit of time. Next we have motion blur, and if you're doing animations, you probably should have this one on. This of course doesn't reduce the render time, but it makes your scene look more realistic. The only thing that I would change here, I find that this is way too high, so I will usually go to 0.15, 0.2, 0.3. However, I always recommend you do a 5 to 10 frame test render before rendering your whole scene. It's an awful feeling to come back to your render after 2 hours and see that it's an unusable blur. We also have an option for rolling shutter, and this is actually a distortion, so I would actually never use this thing. Next we have the film panel. This is the most useful option, and it allows you to have a transparent background. So here in this scene I have an HDRI that I use both as the background and the lighting of the scene. If I click on transparent, you'll see that the background is now transparent. This is useful if you want to post-process your scene in Photoshop and add a different background. I'm gonna go next to performance. Here the most important option is here in the memory usage. You might want to use tiling if you find that you're running out of memory while doing your renders. The idea with tiling doing is that Blender cuts the image in tiles and renders each tile independently. Then it caches those tiles to the disk, and then after it's finished with all of the tiles, it stitches them back together to create the whole scene. I've actually never had any of such problems, so I've never needed to change this, but it's good to keep in mind if you have less memory. Persistent data uses memory to store render data, which is used for the next render. Let's say that you're changing the position of the chair. In that case, this might save you maybe 10 to 50% of render times. I'm gonna check persistent data and I'm gonna render this. The first time it renders, there is no data stored, so this is the normal rendering time. So this render took 1 minute and 51 seconds. So I'm just gonna move the chair a little bit and I'm gonna render this again. And this render took 31 seconds. You can see it's a different render because the chair is in a different place. Freestyle is a really cool feature that adds a line edge overlay that you can use to achieve a stylized feel or to make edges more visible in models that only have one material. It's also useful to give a more technical quality to the scene. You have a couple of options here. Absolute draws the line based on the specified line thickness, while relative draws the thickness based on the vertical resolution of the render. If you enable freestyle here, then if you go to the view layer properties, you'll see all of these new panels. Keep in mind that using the freestyle takes more time because it renders the strokes after denoising the image, so it's an additional process that will take a few extra seconds. The main settings to know here are in the freestyle panel, the crease angle is a threshold for Blender to draw a stroke. Anything below the angle will draw a stroke, so the smaller the angle, the less strokes you will see. I'm gonna render this with 75 degrees just for you to see the difference. And you can see that some of the lines that were drawn on the previous render are not drawn here. In the line set panel, you can select here the edge types for which it should render a stroke. Logical OR is draw a line for any of the selections here. Logical AND is draw a line for only the edges that comply with all of the conditions simultaneously. In the Freestyle Strokes panel, you can add dashed lines of up to 3 repeating segments. Units here are in pixels. So if I want a normal dashed line, I would type 10 here and then 10 in the gap, and if I render that, I get a normal dotted line. But for example, I wanted a segment, then a gap, then a shorter segment, then a gap, and then repeat, I can do that. Let's say I want segments of 10, then segments of 5, and I want to have a gap of 5 between each segment. And if I render that, now we have what we wanted, long and short segments alternating. In Freestyle Color, you can change the color of the line, and in Freestyle Alpha, you can change the transparency of the line. You can change the thickness here, and in fact, you'll see that you can add modifiers. I'm going to show you just one, the noise modifier. You can change the amplitude, so how much the thickness will vary, and the period, which you can also think of as the size of the noise. So I'm going to change this to 50 and the amplitude to 2, and I'm going to render that again. And now you see that I've changed the color, and also it varies the thickness of the stroke. I'm going to go back here, and finally color management. The most important setting here is the view transform, and you usually want AGX for more realistic renders, but you can also go to Filmic, that was the previous default setting, or Filmic Log if you're planning on taking this to video editing software and want to do some color grading over there. I explained AGX in this video if you want to check that out next, and that's it for the render settings. I'm Blender. Happy blending.